Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Hopefully, everyone had a great fall break. We're in week 8 of Seed 540. So, just want to spend some time talking a little bit about the groups for the Theory into Practice presentations. As a reminder, the videos and discussion board questions are due the Wednesday of your assigned week. Your group is responsible for posting the questions and monitoring the discussion board. Post follow-up questions, ask for clarification, so on and so forth. You're going to be teaching this week. You're going to be presenting your material. Someone had a question about the best way to post the videos in the discussion board. What I have found is to load them into YouTube and then post from a YouTube account. Blackboard can be a little bit quirky, a little bit weird, but YouTube seems to be the way to go. If you're able to download your videos, post them into YouTube, and then transfer them from YouTube into Blackboard, that is the best way to go. But again, due by Wednesday of your chosen week here. So we have this chart in Blackboard, but please take a moment to note when your group's presentation week is. And this week, we have here the Learning Theories group. So just to lead in here, do you know of any famous teachers and what made them famous? Does anyone know who this person is? She's one of my absolute favorite famous teachers. That's Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. That's one of my absolute favorite quotes from her. She was an incredible teacher, and sometimes when we think about how we want to be in a classroom, we can remember some famous teachers in our that we've encountered over the years as a source of inspiration for us in the classroom. Okay, so this week's tasks. This week, please read chapter 13 in the big book, and we have here 2 case studies that I'd like to have you read. In the discussion board, as a reminder, we have the Learning Theories group. They're going to be posting their video and they're going to be posting questions. We're going to be following the same format, so please post for each question thread by Saturday and a response to each question thread by Sunday. We're going to start at the quizzes again, and I would ask you to start looking at the case study project in Blackboard. So in the assignment directions folder, you'll notice that there's some information there on the case study project. Please take a moment to look through that, start familiarizing yourself with that material. The motivation papers will be graded by October 22nd. Please be on the lookout for those in Blackboard. Okay, so a few comments on the tasks. Lots of overlapping things going on again this week. We have here the Theory into Practice groups, again, posting the video and discussion board questions in your appropriate week in the discussion board. And we're going to be looking at learning theories this week. Okay, so main ideas. The APA Top 20 Principles this week we're going to be looking at as they relate to learning and effective teaching. We have here Principle 2, what students already know affects their learning. Principle 5, acquiring long-term knowledge and skill is largely dependent on practice. Principle 6, clear, explanatory, and timely feedback to students is important for learning. And finally, Principle 11, teachers' expectations about their students affect students' opportunities to learn, their motivation, and their learning outcomes. If you recall from last week before fall break, we were talking about motivation. We presented the motivation framework and this very important quote, motivation is the process whereby goal-directed activity is instigated and sustained. So it's important to keep in mind this quote as we move forward here this week. Because we are going to be talking about, we're going to be exploring this central question for the remainder of the class. How do I create opportunities to promote development of and support student motivation in my current or future classroom? So this central question is going to be driving the rest of the conversations here for the remainder of the course. And we're going to be looking at several things that can help answer this particular question. We're going to be looking at instructional variables and practices, so the lesson structure, the strategy, and the assessment practices that you're going to be using in the classroom. We're going to be looking at learning environment, classroom arrangement, the classroom climate and culture, and the classroom management. We're going to be looking at relationships between students to students and teachers to students. We've already started to explore this concept in several of our theories, but we're going to be looking at and seeing how we can apply that in a very practical way. We're going to be looking at teacher and student roles and expectations. Again, we've already started talking about this, but going a little bit into more complexity and depth in this particular item. And then finally, equity. We've been talking about equity throughout this course, but we're going to spend some time specifically talking about it. For this class, we're going to be looking at the instructional variables and practices and how we can answer this particular question. How do I create opportunities to promote the development of and support student motivation in my current and future classroom? We're going to be looking again at the instructional variables and practices. All right, so in the textbook, you'll see where the idea of instructional variables and practices, there are three separate components to this. We have here the models of instruction. They're going to be going through that in the book. They're going to be looking at essential teaching skills, and then finally feedback. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. The first one here is models of instruction. Now there are many different types of models of instruction, but in the book they go through the big ones, and I just wanted to briefly touch on each of these. The first model of instruction is direct instruction, teaching model designed to help students acquire well-defined knowledge and skills. So that's what we all know is the traditional model of teaching, where it's direct, it's coming from the teacher, it's the sage on the stage. Then we have here the lecture discussion model, where it's designed to help students acquire topic, connect facts, concepts, generalizations to make relationships among them explicit. So you have a lecture, and at the very end, you have a discussion. Again, a very typical, common model of instruction. Then you have your guided discovery, instructional model that involves teachers scaffolding a student's constructions and concepts and the relations among them. Okay, so we've already talked about this notion of constructivism, and constructivism is part of the guided discovery model of instruction. Then we have here some models that we're starting to see more and more in the classroom that are becoming more commonplace. We have your cooperative learning. Instructional strategies is in which students work in mixed ability groups to reach specific cognitive and social development objectives. Okay, so in that definition, the two things that I want to point out there is that students are in mixed, variety of students, ability groups to reach specific objectives. Okay, so you have in these in the cooperative learning model, you have groups where you have mixed abilities, students of maybe higher abilities mixed with students that are maybe with lower abilities, so that there can be some teaching opportunities among the group members. There are three components that are important in cooperative learning, and teachers often forget these three key things in cooperative learning. That there needs to be a goal for what the students are doing. They just can't kind of willy-nilly come up with stuff on their own. They need to be able to have a specific goal that they're working towards. There needs to be a concept of interdependence, and by that we mean that students need to have specific roles within the group. So who's going to do what? That is particularly key in the lower secondary grades, particularly in middle school. Students are starting to understand how to work cooperatively in groups, that really needs to be modeled very explicitly in the middle school years. Who does what? Because students are not good at coming up with these things on their own in middle school, from what I've seen. So to be able to model that, explicitly explain it to the students, that concept of interdependence in the group. And the last thing that is key, and this is the thing that teachers often get wrong, is that they grade the group without having an individual component. As you can probably remember from your years in school, there's nothing worse than to have your grade tied to the entire group when your group is just going underwater. So to have that individual component that is graded in the cooperative learning model is important so that students can feel like they have a sense of agency, that their entire grade is not tied to the group. The next model of instruction is getting a lot of traction here these days, particularly with the role of Khan Academy. So it's the flipped instruction model. It's an approach to teaching where the students view new content online at home, usually, by watching video lectures, and then they come to school to practice those concepts in a very guided and scaffolded way with the teacher. So they maybe watch the video on Khan Academy, then they come to school and do some practice problems in class. The teacher can explain it, they can correct them in the moment. So essentially they're doing their homework at school, kind of flipped. The last one is, the second to last one here is personalized learning. This is the instruction where the pace of learning and the instructional approach is optimized to meet the needs of each learner. So the choice plays a critical role. You often see this model of instruction with the Montessori model, where students have a very big say in what they do and how they learn. And it's very individually driven. It's not classroom driven, if that makes sense. We're also starting to see this with some of the gaming that goes on particularly in math, where you're starting to see where the instruction is at the pace of the student, and it kind of builds, there's an behind the scenes algorithm that kind of moves the students along and paces them according to their ability. And there's choice, students want to play the little games, and there's like the main screens, like play this little game, play this little game. And so there's that element of choice built into that as well. But I do want to spend some time here talking about the model of differentiating instruction. This is the model that you'll be hearing time and time again here when you enter into the classroom. It's the process of adapting learning experiences to meet the needs of students who vary in background, knowledge, skills, needs, and motivations. This comes from Carol Tomlinson. She's the main theorist behind this model of instruction. And I want to spend some time looking at this particular model of instruction because, again, you're going to be seeing this more and more. So this chart does a really good job of explaining what differentiation really is. You hear this word a lot in education, differentiation. But what does it mean? What does that really mean practically in your classroom? Okay, so it's guided by the mindset that you have a base quality curriculum, that there's a curriculum that can be accessed by all of your students. And it's built on the concept that there's continuous assessment involved in this. So you see here this guided by mindset and general principles of differentiation, the different things that go into differentiation. Now, where the rubber hits the road and what teachers have to do is that teachers can differentiate through content, process, product, effect, and learning environment. Again, what's key here is that you have the base curriculum. The curriculum doesn't change, but the content inside that curriculum can change, and that you can differentiate that based on students' needs and interests. You can also differentiate through the process, how fast you go, the speed in which you're presenting the material, different kinds of modalities. Are you going to be presenting it through a video? Are you going to be presenting it through kinesthetic learning? The processes that go into teaching that particular content. Then you have the product, and that's like the homework or the projects or the things that come out of the learning experience. You can differentiate through that. So for example, some students are perfectly okay with producing an essay. Some students really are okay with producing written work, whereas some students would prefer to give a speech. Some students would prefer to maybe do a visual presentation of the material. That can be differentiated. The actual product of the learning can be differentiated. And then we talk about the effect. So, any kinds of how you can differentiate in the engagement with students. And then finally, the learning environment, how you can make sure that your classroom is meeting the needs of all your different learners. So for example, again, going back to the example where some students are maybe more visual learners, you can maybe have the little library or, like a center in your classroom where you have a library set up. But then there may be a space in your classroom where maybe you have where there's a kind of more of a quiet space where they can do listen to audio presentations or podcasts or audiobooks. So making sure that your classroom environment is meeting the needs of various students. And again, you can differentiate according to students' readiness, how ready they are for that material, their interest, and then their learning profile. So their readiness is like, are they really ready to learn about this? And this is where that developmental psychology comes into play. Knowing your students and where they're at developmentally may be important. So case in point, English class or language arts class is a place where you might see this. You may have you want to have the students read a particular textbook. So for example, maybe it's To Kill a Mockingbird. Maybe the students aren't ready to access that material yet. They haven't quite reached the maturity to be able to read that particular textbook or that particular novel. This is important in those middle school years. Again, you may have some classes that are really on, developmentally ready for material and some classes that maybe aren't. So to be able to assess that according to the students' readiness for the material. And again, interest, we've talked about this here before, and then learning profile, again, understanding where your students' strengths are and how they learn best. And then using instructional strategies such as graphic organizers, scaffold reading, cubing, learning contracts, so all those little different things in your teaching toolkit that you can pull out to meet the needs of the students. Okay, so the next section in the textbook is essential teaching skills. This is such a broad overview, but please do spend some time reading through this in the textbook. I think it's important that they bring up the importance of organization, creating well-established routines, and have all your materials ready. As you've learned in the development theories, that notion of having predictability is important for students to have well-established routines, how you hand in material, how you come into the classroom, how you prepare yourself for the class, all those little routines that you need to set up as a teacher at the beginning of the year. It's important when students come in that you have a warm-up, there's some sort of element of review to refresh their learning from the previous class. Again, having that focus, that hook to be able to get their attention, to bring them into the material. The questioning frequency, the equitable distribution prompting, it's all that kind of stuff that you're making sure that are you asking the right questions? Is your speed correct? Are you making sure that you're ping-ponging between various students, engaging them in the conversation? Is it equitable distribution? Are you making sure that you're calling on not just the student that's sitting right in front of you in the classroom, but the students scattered throughout the class? Prompting, that wait time, that quiet time to allow students to reflect. The closure and application, so then bringing it all together, this is the tough one because typically you run out of time when you have to do this to make sure that you have some sort of closure at the end of the class. And again, communication, those transition signals, the precise, explicit terms and directions. This is key, again, for middle school and students that are transitioning into high school for freshmen, getting those transition signals and being very explicit. It's like, okay, here's what you need to do next. When I do this, I expect that. And finally, in the textbook, they talk about feedback. We're going to be looking at feedback a little bit later in this course, but I think this does a really good job of providing an overview. Key principles that I'd like to have you focus on here. Focus on changing the student rather than changing the work. That is key. So making sure that the students understand what's expected of them and changing their understanding of it rather than changing the work for them. There's a real temptation to do that as a teacher. When a student doesn't understand something, is to make it more accessible or to kind of adjust it, or, well, you don't have to do problems 1, 2, 3, you can do problems 4, 5, 6. To help them to change their understanding of the work rather than changing the work itself. Learning games learning gains are a result of acting on feedback and knowing what to do with it, not necessarily giving feedback. This is one of my huge pet peeves as an administrator when I saw this in the classroom, is that oftentimes teachers would give feedback, but then not telling students what to do with it. They may go over a test after the students have taken the test, but not really understanding why they did it or how they're going to be using that content moving forward. So it's important to not just give them feedback and then like move on, but to understand how they're going to be using that feedback in the future. Feedback indicates the gap between the current performance and the desired outcome and how to improve future work. That's key. That I think that it's important for us as teachers to understand we just can't give feedback in a vacuum. There has to be a reason behind it. We have to show the students where they were previously between their current performance and then what we need to have them do in the future. Front-loading work focuses on teaching students how to access their own learning and less on my role as a teacher of grading and evaluating. So, for example, making sure that you give very explicit directions on how to do something, how they're going to be getting that particular grade through the use of rubrics. It does require a lot of front-loading on the part of the teacher, but the outcome is that students will clearly understand why they got the grade that they got or the feedback that they got. Feedback can include three major aspects: what they can do now, what they can do next, and what they can do in the future. And again, making sure that you have all three there. It's not just giving feedback for feedback's sake, it's how to use it moving forward. You must have the following when giving feedback as a teacher. Students need to know the intended learning outcomes or goals of the project in order to know what to do with that feedback. So they need to have that rubric to understand, here's what I need to do, and here's what I need to do in order to get this particular grade. They need to understand what they need to do with that feedback, right? Students need to know how to be able to calibrate their performance. And typically we do this by providing an example of what a good paper looks like or a good project so that they can see, okay, so here's what I'm capable of doing. Here's what a really good example of this is. How can I calibrate my own personal performance to meet that ideal? Students need to know how to measure their own progress during learning. So checklists, milestones. A good teacher will provide a project and then say, like, by Monday, I expect this. By Wednesday, you should be able to do this. By Friday, I really need to see this. So that students can learn to pace themselves. Again, this is going to be particularly important for those younger secondary students where they're not used to doing some of these large independent projects on their own. So providing checklists and milestones is important. Students need to know how to evaluate their performance and reasons behind the outcome. And as part of this, self-grading using the rubric, encouraging students to say, what do you think you did here? How do you feel like you did before actual grading takes place? And it involves that conferencing and going over the results. Again, with the idea that you're not just using that information in the moment, it's how you can apply it towards the future. So with that in mind, students need to know how to evaluate their performance and the reasons behind the outcome. Self-grading. How do you think you did on that motivation paper? Did you use the rubric to guide your work? And at this point, looking at the rubric, looking at your work, what grade would you give yourself? What feedback would you give yourself? And if you were in my position in like a more traditional classroom, how would you go over the results of this paper if you were the teacher? How would you engage the students after you hand back the assignment? That might be a great opportunity to have students share, particularly what some of their key findings from the paper, but then how they can use that then moving forward in the future. So what you've learned about motivation, how are you then going to apply that in the classroom personally and sharing that in the classroom so that others can benefit from the experience of their classmates. So that is it for now. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to text me. There is my telephone number. If you have any questions about the upcoming projects or the upcoming papers, if you're experiencing any troubles, please let me know. All right, thank you very much and happy studying.